2011, also translated into Turkish, and as editor, a companion to Venetian history, 1400 to 1797. He is currently working on a book on food and foodways in the early modern Mediterranean. And he is also the editor of the News Untitled and book review editor for the Journal of Early Modern History. Please help me welcome our guest.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to speak today with you. I'm grateful to the Arab German Young Academy and the Orient Institute for Beirut for inviting me and for hosting this lecture that I'm going to present to you today. And as an introduction, that's okay? Now I'm wired. As an introduction, this is a piece of an ongoing project that I've been dabbling with, I guess you could say, for a number of years. Which in some ways is just an excuse to travel the world and eat good food in interesting places, which makes me very happy to be in Lebanon, so that I can do both of those things. But my hope is that eventually this presentation will be part of a larger work entitled Around the Mediterranean Table that will address a variety of topics associated with the culture of food in the early modern Mediterranean. So with that, I want to begin in 21st century France. I'm not sure. We'll see a connection hopefully in a moment. So in France, several years ago, members of a far-right nationalist movement began serving food to Paris's homeless and downtrodden inhabitants. The simple meal included bread, cheese, a glass of wine, and a hot bowl of what was called identity soup. This was a hearty traditional French soup whose key ingredient was pork. Smoked bacon, sausage, pig's ears, feet, tails, all the good stuff. The group's motto was, quote, to help our own before others. And the others they were targeting were poor Muslim immigrants whose religious tradition, of course, forbade the consumption of pork and of wine. This was not an isolated incident, unfortunately. This past January, this year, 2016, in what was described as, quote, the meatball war, a town in Denmark, a country that has, it should be said, 2.5 pigs for every single resident, voted to require public daycare centers and kindergartens to serve pork on their lunch menus as a means to, quote, preserve national identity. In the same vein, several towns in France have attempted to remove non-pork options from school menus as part of an effort to, quote, again, preserve French identity. Former President Nicolas Sarkozy described pork-free lunches as, quote, a threat to our tradition and our way of life. I think there's no question that the power of the pig is widespread. In terms of Muslim self-definition, Bernard Lewis has written that abstention from pork is, quote, universally regarded by Muslims as constituting the immediate and practical distinction between themselves and others. Whether we agree with this or not, we can debate, but this is what he says. Indeed, a recent study found that by far the most common disavowal ritual among former British Muslims and the most difficult and definitive symbol of their leaving Islam was the consumption of pig meat, or losing, as one of them described it, one's pork virginity in leaving the faith. So the most difficult sort of passage for many of these individuals who left Islam was eating a bacon roll. As these examples suggest, in contemporary Europe, food is regularly mobilized in a wide range of political and religious matters, and pork often occupies a privileged position in these cultural conflicts. One could argue that analogs exist in the banning of the sale or even consumption of pork products in certain majority Muslim countries, such as Saudi Arabia, or in bans of beef consumption in India. In each instance, food becomes a potent instrument in conflicts over much larger issues related to agriculture, globalization, and immigration. At their core, all of these food fights center in one way or another on the relationship of food to identity. The linkage of food to identity, of course, has a long pedigree. One of the earliest writers on European food, the Parisian politician, judge, and bon vivant, Anthelme Brillat-Savarin, in his hugely successful 1825 book, Physiologie du goût, Méditation de gastronomie transcendante, famously wrote one of the most oft-repeated phrases, I guess one of the great titles of a book on food as well, it has to be said. Brillat-Savarin wrote one of the most oft-repeated phrases in food studies: "Tell me what you eat, and I will tell you what you are." Brillat-Savarin was not issuing a manifesto about healthy eating or trying to market a new diet. Indeed, given his intense appreciation of food, which is not fully conveyed by this slimmed-down image of him, he would likely have been quite surprised to see the ways in which contemporary culture has appropriated his aphorism. What he was suggesting was the tight cultural link between what has been called the Siamese twins of food and identity. By our food, he wrote, we declare and affirm who we are and who we want to be. And so food, for Brillat-Savarin and for many subsequent scholars, is a language, a form of communication. Building on Brillat-Savarin's observation, modern scholars have written extensively on the relationship of food to identity. Because of the biological imperative that we eat and drink regularly, and the central role that the acquisition, production, and consumption of food plays in our existence, it functions as a potent social, religious, gender, political, and cultural marker. The sum total of one's food-related activities and attitudes, or foodways, form a sort of culinary identity that serves to both define and to differentiate. Those who eat similar foods are deemed trustworthy and safe, while those whose foods differ are viewed often with suspicion and even revulsion. One area that is profoundly marked by food is religion. Food is firmly embedded in every faith's definition of religiosity. It functions as a symbol, as a subject of petition, as a form of communion. Many religions articulate dietary codes that classify food dichotomies of clean and unclean, edible and abominable, sacred and profane. Food has been described as serving as the sacred cement that defines and differentiates communities of faith through rules on what they eat and how they eat it, as well as rituals of sacrifice, feasting, and fasting. This evening I would like to examine the many ways in which food informed religious and communal identity in the early modern Mediterranean Sea. To illustrate this, I would like to focus actually quite narrowly on the unique and illustrative case of the Moriscos of early modern Spain, which is an amply documented and well-studied case that I think speaks to the situation in early modern Iberia, but also can suggest insights into the broader Mediterranean context. The Moriscos represent a suggestive case study of the complex ways in which food functioned and was manipulated in the manufacture of religious and communal identities. In the light of the dramatic social, political, and economic change Spain experienced in this time period. In particular, I want to focus on, we could look at many food commodities, but I want to focus on wine and pork, which of course have historically occupied a privileged position in articulating cultural and religious boundaries within the Mediterranean. What I will argue is that an examination of patterns of consumption of these commodities, pork and wine, challenges the prevailing notion of a culinary clash of civilizations at the Mediterranean, or rather at least complicates that notion, and suggests the need for caution in drawing overly stark culinary boundaries between religious communities in what was a highly connected Mediterranean characterized by a richly dynamic and nuanced food culture. So the question of the Moriscos, or Little Moors, has been described as one of the nodal issues of the history of the early modern Mediterranean, a splinter, as it's been called, in the heart of Spain. For over half a millennium, as you well know, Muslim, Jew, and Christian lived side by side in the Iberian Peninsula in a complex, often tranquil, though at times uneasy state of social and confessional pluralism, which Spanish scholars have termed convivencia. This fragile but long-lived balance began to disintegrate, particularly around 1400, as the position of Spain's Muslim and Jewish minorities eroded significantly, most notably beginning with the Jewish massacre of 1391, then the first limpieza di sangre decrees in 1449, and finally with the reinstitution of the Inquisition in 1478. All of these, of course, occurring against the backdrop of the so-called Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. This process culminated with the fall of the final Muslim outpost in the peninsula, the city that you see before you, the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, on the 1st of January 1492, which ushered in a new era in relation between the peninsula's religious cultures. The Treaty of Granada of 1492 guaranteed specific cultural and religious rights for Muslims and Jews. Almost immediately, however, their new sovereigns, Isabella and Ferdinand, began to disregard the treaty. In March 1492, barely 2 months after the treaty, all Jews were given 4 months to either convert or depart. Their numbers were already significantly reduced because of the violence and difficulties in the previous century. The much larger Muslim minority was spared for a time, but efforts to peaceably convert them became much more aggressive after 1495 under the crusading Cardinal Jiménez de Cisneros, and this eventually led to a revolt in late 1499. The uprising was quickly snuffed out, but it provided a pretext to implement the crown's cherished objective of a kingdom united in its worship of what the rulers perceived as the one true faith. Over the next 25 years, all of Spain's Muslims were faced with the choice of either conversion or exile under onerous terms. Some fled, but most had no real choice but to convert, which they did en masse in huge public ceremonies. The character of the Morisco's conversion, and you see here a Morisco woman from the famous Trachtenbuch of Christoph Weiditz of 1531-32. The character of the Morisco's conversion and their religious identity was clearly problematic given the circumstances of their conversion. Though Christians generally denounced coerced conversion, just as Muslims, theologically it was nonetheless held to be legitimate and irreversible. And so the Moriscos, whatever the condition of their conversion, were now considered Christian. Spain's sovereigns certainly considered them as legally converted to Christianity, though they also understood the limitations of these conversions implemented as they were through what has been described as the pedagogy of fear. It was believed, at least initially, that over time the Moriscos could in fact be transformed into true Christians, unlike the experience with what were perceived as much more intransigent Jews, which is why they had been expelled. As time passed, however, doubts about this hope for conversion began to arise. The religiously suspect Moriscos were increasingly viewed as false Christians and as crypto-Muslims, who dissimulated their true religious identity and secretly and deceptively continued to practice Islam. Morisco exteriority was considered a challenge to the ongoing attempt to forge a common, homogeneous Spanish identity, and as a threat to the security of the state and the authority of the church. And we have to understand this against the backdrop of a very recently united Spain under Isabel and Ferdinand. This fed into a broader hermeneutic of suspicion that existed in general towards converts in the early modern Mediterranean, and I would say more broadly in Europe and beyond as well as a pervasive climate of fear in Spain in which the Moriscos were seen as a sort of fifth column who might ally themselves with the Habsburgs' chief arch rival, the Ottomans, and might bring down this rather fragile kingdom, or so it seemed. The growing tension between the crown and its newly converted subjects produced a standoff in which royal and religious institutions tried to bring about the assimilation of the Moriscos into Christian culture. And they were met in turn by varying degrees of resistance. This political and cultural struggle played out in a variety of ways. There were, as we've seen from the very beginning, a number of popular uprisings, some of them quite large and lasting for several years. But more common were probably the weapons of the weak, as James Scott has described them, many smaller acts of resistance. At the core of this confrontation was a constellation of questions regarding religious identity. What is the essence of the religious self? Does it manifest itself through internal belief or through external practice? What is the relationship between those two? How can it be measured? How can it be assessed? And most importantly, can it be altered through conversion? And if so, what is the evidence that such a change has taken place? These are all questions that are very important in the Iberian context and more broadly throughout the Mediterranean in this period. These questions were central to the Morisco problem, particularly as doubts about their conversion began very quickly to crystallize. In 1526, a junta in Granada concluded that in order to achieve true conversion and complete assimilation, all Morisco particularism must be prohibited. It proposed, and here you see an image of the conversion of the Muslims beginning in 1501. This junta in 1526 proposed a series of measures that linked religious identity to cultural praxis. Muslim-inflicted so-called deviant customs were seen as a, quote, a source of contamination for Moriscos and evidence of an insincere and incomplete conversion. Another image from Weiditz's Trachtenbuch. These cultural practices also caused discord and prejudice with the old Christians, which prevented the creation of a unified royal community, a kingdom. The notion was that suppressing Morisco cultural distinctiveness would efface ties to their Islamic past and facilitate their assimilation into Christian Spanish society. By dealing with the exterior, the interior would follow. Thus, policies designed to inhibit what were called, quote, Moorish customs related to dress, song and dance, as you see here in this Zambra, famous Morisco dance, washing and hygiene, depicted here, and the use of Arabic as well. All of these were initiated in this time period. And language is, I think, a very interesting part of this process of conversion. Do you have to change your language? Can a Christian speak Arabic? Is an important question for the rulers of Spain. One of the chief points of friction in this escalating confrontation was food. Foodways came to be perceived by political and ecclesiastical authorities as an essential component of Morisco separatism. And to the degree that they resisted assimilation, which is a matter, as we'll see, of some debate, food played a crucial role in Morisco attempts to preserve their cultural and religious identity. For Spanish authorities, food was of particular significance in the broader conflict because, unlike belief, food was seen as an exterior, accessible mark of the interior individual. In this game of exchanging identities, food thus was a primary indicator of religious intent. In addition, it was widely believed that the consumption of Christian foodstuffs and the abandonment of Muslim foodways would lead to an actual transformation of the Morisco's physical constitution. In short, Christian food, it was believed, made Christians. A whole range of Islamic-inflected culinary practices thus came under the scrutiny of the primary institution, the Spanish Inquisition, which played a leading role in confronting the Morisco issue. Examples from inquisitional records abound addressing this issue of food and religious identity. In Toledo in 1538, for example, a Morisco was arrested for a variety of heretical activities, including playing music, quote, playing music at night, dancing the zambra, and eating couscous. Which, though widely consumed in Spain and throughout the Mediterranean, in 16th century Spain and within this new religious context, had come to be seen as an unchristian food because of its status as a staple throughout the North African and other parts of the so-called Muslim Mediterranean. In another instance, a woman and her daughter were prosecuted because they had celebrated, quote, the Easter of the Moros, with fried eggs and crullers, fried bread, basically. Muslims were so closely associated with these crullers or fritters, buñuelos, that simply working as a buñolero, someone who made these fritters, could cause suspicions of improper belief. Refusing to eat, quote, animals that had died a natural death, not sitting in a chair or eating at a table, avoiding food and drink during Ramadan, or even rejecting an invitation to eat a meal with an old Christian, all of these could result in denunciation before the Inquisition. Authorities tried to snare what they considered recalcitrant and dissimulating Moriscos by sending sheriffs into homes unannounced at mealtimes, looking for families eating foods, quote, prepared in the Muslim manner, seated on the ground in traditional fashion. Indeed, to facilitate the identification of non-conforming foodways, new Christians, as Moriscos were called in Granada, were ordered to, quote, keep the doors to their houses open on Fridays and holidays. Though even with the doors closed, the smells of food cooking in the narrow alleyways of the city provided ample evidence for inquisitional spies. Among the many culinary markers of religious identity, beyond couscous, eggplant, crullers, and many, many other foods that we could point to, in early modern Spain, the most compelling foods are suggested by one of the so-called edicts of faith, which were promulgated by the Inquisition and were intended to instruct old Christians on how to identify crypto-Muslim new Christian neighbors. They were specifically instructed to watch for individuals who, quote, have not eaten bacon or drunk wine in accordance with Moorish custom. While a whole range of what were coded as Muslim culinary practices came under scrutiny, these two foods were held to mark sincere Christianity, conversion to Christianity, and the abandonment of Islam most fully and completely. That is pork and wine. And these two commodities had for centuries formed what one scholar has called the base of the triangle of differentiation between Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Pork, or what Martin Harris has called the abominable pig, occupied a privileged position as a marker of cultural distinction. While the Mediterranean has been characterized as both a porcophile space and a porcophobic region, there is no question where modern Spain falls on this spectrum. The pig is the most important animal in the Spanish diet, the king of the Spanish kitchen. Spain has the highest level of meat consumption in Europe, with pork making up 50% of the total. And it is the continent's second largest pork producer. There are over 20 million pigs in Spain, and every one of their body parts, including snouts, ears, tails, brains, trotters, is used in one way or another in the Spanish diet. This is in contemporary Spain. This affinity, Spanish affinity for pork, has deep historical roots. Pork was perhaps the most popular meat in Roman Hispania, and the Celts fed their pigs on acorns and chestnuts and made cured pork products that are the precursors of Spain's famous culture today of jamón. In post-classical Spain, pork was the most common and often the only meat consumed. It was the cheapest meat on the market, and it was essential for survival because pigs reproduce quickly and in large litters, are easy to raise, can be preserved by smoking, pickling, or being made into sausages, salamis, or pâté, and pig fat, preserved as lard, was essential to and one of the defining ingredients in Christian cooking during the Middle Ages. Pork was also considered the most nourishing meat because of its similarity to human flesh, which made it easier to digest and convert into human flesh. That's sort of a semi-interesting, I think, aside to this story. When the Spanish conquistadors arrive in the New World in Mexico and encounter the Aztecs with their cannibalistic sort of practices, pork is introduced as a substitute for human flesh in the Aztec diet. And in fact, according to conquistador accounts, the Aztecs say it tastes a lot like human flesh, so for what that's worth. Given its importance in the Christian Spanish diet, then, it's not surprising that the pig took on such significance in issues related to Islam during the early modern period. In comparison to the Old Testament, which is a treasure trove of forbidden flesh, the Quran is relatively free of meat taboos. Pork is really the only meat that is explicitly forbidden in the Quran, which characterizes it as disgusting. This prohibition is repeated twice, as well in the Quran, as well as in numerous hadith, which also forbid Muslims from buying or even raising pigs. This practice was not necessarily unknown. Commentators historically attributed the taboo to the pig's unattractive habits. It's an omnivore. It eats its own excrement. It is especially zealous in prolonging copulation, which led to the belief that pork consumption led to moral laxity in humans. According to legend, in response to an appeal from Noah for help cleaning up the filth in the ark, Allah produced a pair of pigs for him from elephant dung. Tradition held that Jesus had changed a group of hostile Jews into swine, which gave rise to the popular view that pigs were metamorphosed wicked individuals. It was also commonly believed that a prayer was automatically voided if a pig passed by. Abstention from pork, as Bernard Lewis said earlier, became one of the key markers of Muslim identity, both from within and without. And in turn, for Muslims, the pig played an absolute symbolic role in terms of their own representations of Christendom and its polluted nature. For Spanish Moriscos faced with escalating persecution, the pig came to occupy an important place in articulating both their own religious identity and their resistance to conversion and assimilation. And I would argue that it comes to occupy a much more important place than it previously had. For example, the influential 1462 Alhamyado Sunni breviary under the listing of principal commandments and prohibitions states, "Do not eat pork, nor any carrion flesh, nor blood, or any suspect thing." A 16th century Morisco source listed the consumption of pork as one of the 17 mortal sins, along with rejecting Allah, murdering a fellow Muslim, and disobeying parents. Various explanations for the pork taboo circulated among the Morisco community specifically. The most commonly held view was that a pig one day brushed up against the Prophet and soiled his new cloak and was thus cursed. Whatever the reason, many came to see the rejection of pork as a condition for their salvation and a symbol of their union to the community, the larger community of Islam. Thus, Moriscos referred to Christians as, quote, worshippers of the cross and eaters of pork. And the word pig was one of their sharpest insults. Not surprisingly, then, their reactions to pork could be visceral. One woman, according to the Inquisition, when told that a meal she had just eaten with, quote, good appetite had actually contained pork, immediately stuck her fingers in her mouth and vomited. When Christians in the Inquisition's prisons attempted to haze and provoke their Morisco co-inmates by frying bacon, those Moriscos plugged their noses and fled to avoid even the smell of pork. A ballad written by a leader of a 1568 rebellion decries being compelled to listen to the preacher, quote, harsh-voiced as a screaming owl, while he the wine and pork invoketh. When King Philip II visited a city in southern Spain in 1585, the inhabitants refused to eat pork or drink wine with him, and following the king's departure, they destroyed, quote, all the glassware and pottery that had been used for the obnoxious food and drink. Moriscos who ate pork faced communal pressure to sustain the culinary divide. When Lorenzo de Solena caught neighbors eating pork, he rebuked them and, quote, tried to strengthen them in the faith by reminding them of the importance of the pork taboo to the Muslim community. Pork was also used to demarcate boundaries and to assay religious conviction and conversion by Spanish ecclesiastical and political authorities. In the days before the Moriscos' expulsion in 1609, a commission identified 9 qualities that were evidence of a sincere conversion to Christianity. These included the obvious: attendance at Mass, participation in religious processions, membership in confraternities, but also included, quote, regularly eating pork and habitually drinking wine. The Inquisition was obsessed with the pig. Pork was considered a key indicator of crypto-Muslims. Indeed, a popular inquisitorial manual of the day prescribed giving, quote, forbidden foods to converts to gauge their religious commitment. Quote, those who refuse to eat or drink will be considered a suspect of heresy. In Valencia, refusing pork and wine was served as proof of Islamicizing without even consuming them. And though officials usually attributed or sought additional corroborating evidence, a man in Zaragoza was sentenced to 200 lashes solely for refusing to eat both. A shared meal might innocently or intentionally unveil a crypto-Muslim, as when a man in Arcos was denounced to the Inquisition once again for refusing to eat eggs that were prepared in pork lard by a neighbor. In fact, even a simple statement like, "the pig is a vermin," could produce an inquiry. You can see how the Inquisition is obsessed with pigs. Inquisitorial officials regularly entered Morisco homes unannounced to ensure that, quote, they were cooking with pork fat and pork products. This may have contributed to the popularity of pork in Spain. Jerusalem and Malta spoke Arabic and wore Arab dress, as did the Moriscos, yet their Christian faith went unchallenged by inquisitions in these countries. At the core of Moulet's defense was the contention that the Moriscos were loyal subjects of the crown by 1567 when he was writing, and that they were good Christians, despite their preservation of certain cultural practices. There is a growing body of evidence that supports his contention. Contrary to the traditional image of Moriscos as committed crypto-Muslims, tenaciously holding on to their banned faith in secret, by the second or third generation after the conquest, a significant portion of the community seems to have increasingly and seemingly with sincerity begun to embrace their new Christian faith. This was not just the case from the Moriscos' perspective. Many old Christians reported exactly the same. Far from an intractable civilizational hatred, as Fernand Braudel termed it, that prevented Morisco assimilation, Francisco Marquez Villanueva, in his influential El Problema Morisco, has argued that Moriscos and old Christians could have lived together without conflict, and in fact did often live together without conflict, had political and religious authorities not intervened and created a situation in which traditional cultural practices within a shared communal context were reclassified as heterodox and dangerous. There is, in fact, I think, a tendency to overstate the religious differences that characterized early modern Iberia and indeed the early modern Mediterranean. A tendency to divide the peninsula too starkly down religious and civilizational lines. Moments of confrontation tend to obscure the more pacific day-to-day reality and mask the permeable, fuzzy boundaries of this interconfessional space where religious identity and practice were, in fact, quite malleable. As one scholar has described it, in the Mediterranean, the confrontation of cultures was more constant than in Northern Europe, but the certainty of faith was no stronger. This was certainly true of early modern Spain, which was characterized by a diverse blend of community traditions, superstitions, folklore, and imprecise dogmatic beliefs. The view that religion was culturally contingent and that, quote, everyone can find salvation in his own faith was widespread. Christian peasants asserted, quote, that God feeds the Muslims and heretics just as the same as he feeds the Christians. And the good Jew and the good Muslim can, if they act correctly, go to heaven, just like the good Christian. Moriscos held similar views. One man claimed that the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian laws were, quote, all good, even holy, and that in all three, those who kept its laws will be saved. As one scholar has noted, despite the rampant stereotypes that attempt to pigeonhole Spain's others, religious identity in counter-Reformation Spain was never really crystal clear. And again, there's a deep tradition, background against which this is taking place. There was great variability in imprecision and belief, and praxis, more than theology, marked communal and individual religious identities. This imprecision was of concern to religious and political authorities who were increasingly intent on defining and enforcing orthodoxy by staking out much starker boundaries of language, costume, social conventions, and of course, foodways. We have seen how wine, far from being a marker of difference, was in many ways part of a shared culinary culture that transcended perhaps exaggerated boundaries of difference, and indeed marked a common point of contact between new Christians, old Christians, and even Jews. The cultural frontiers of medieval Spain had always been highly permeable to transcultural exchange, and this is evident in its shared foodways. Very, very broadly speaking here, Spanish cuisine was rooted in Mediterranean commodities and Roman cuisine, which provided its substratum. To this equation were added numerous Arab foods, spices, and preparations, which profoundly impacted the entire peninsula's food culture, not just that of southern Spain. This continued apace with the introduction of American foods in the 16th and 17th centuries, most of which were already being adopted and transforming peninsular cuisines well before they were embraced in other parts of the Mediterranean and continental Europe. Medieval sources provide ample evidence of vibrant foodways with commodities, dishes, and preparations that were not confined to one ethnic or religious group. The differences that certainly did exist were more a product of socio-economic variation, probably, than religious or cultural differences. Medieval Spanish Muslims, Jews, and Christians, from the royal household to the peasant hovel, ate and clearly enjoyed many of the very same foods as their neighbors. One example among many is the iconic Christian Tarta de Santiago de Compostela, which is derived from a Passover cake that Jews introduced to the region when they fled the Almohads in the 12th century. Another was the ubiquitous stews, which were inspired by Arabic and Jewish precedents. Though seemingly a culinary boundary par excellence, the culture of pork in Spain, too, was more nuanced than the reductionist formulas of the Inquisition allow for. And I've chosen to illustrate this with this famous painting by the Italian artist Giuseppe Arcimboldo, the cook, in which you see a pig turning into a face when our perspective is changed on the painting. And I think the same is true when we alter our perspective on foodways in the Iberian Peninsula. So the culture of pork in Spain was somewhat more nuanced than the reductionist formulas of the Inquisition allow for, just as we've seen was the case with wine. Whilst pork certainly was an important part of Christian culinary practice, this should not be exaggerated. In part, this is because meat consumption experienced a precipitous decline in early modern Spain. Poor peasants ate on average only about 50 grams of meat a day, divided primarily between pork and beef, which was also consumed in quantities, and supplemented, interestingly, by growing quantities of cod, which were a much better, actually, source of protein than beef. In addition, fast days during which no meat was consumed numbered over a third of all the days on the liturgical calendar. The primary way in which pork did enter the Christian diet was as lard, which was commonly used in medieval Spanish cooking, but began, in fact, to be replaced by olive oil during the 16th century. Thus, pork, though it served as a powerful symbol, was not actually eaten by the whole of Catholic Spain that frequently, nor was it that central to the diet. Rather, it was what people aspired to eat. It's not to say that they didn't eat pork, but not in the quantities that we might expect, nor that the Inquisition would suggest were necessary. Pork did not always represent an unbreachable fault line either. Christians in medieval Al-Andalus often refrained from eating pork voluntarily and out of respect for Muslim sensibilities. The same took place among Copts in Egypt and Melkites in Syria. For their part, the Muslim rulers of medieval Spain tolerated pig husbandry, pork was sold by butchers in the market, and there were even theoretical texts that defended its consumption. Though rare, it was not unknown in certain contexts for Muslims even to eat pork, including in medieval Sicily and among some Berbers in Morocco. As for the Moriscos, as the Inquisition's extensive evidence indicates, pork consumption became increasingly widespread over the course of the 16th century, both by the admission of the Moriscos and corroborated once again by the testimony of their old Christian neighbors, who often came to the Inquisition in defense of their new Christian Morisco neighbors. Several examples among many will suffice from the Inquisitional records. A 1571 list of individuals in an auto de fe in Granada described Sebastián de Alcaraz as, quote, a Morisco and a pig keeper who was found in possession also of several, quote, Moorish prayers and other things from the Quran of Muhammad. End quote. In another example, Andalusian Moriscos who were resettled in the 16th century in parts of central and northern Spain became famous as street vendors and disseminated the popular pinchos morunos, marinated and spiced pork kebabs throughout the peninsula. And finally, at the time of the expulsion, a Morisco wrote a memorial verified by numerous old Christian friends and witnesses that he and his family, quote, had always eaten bacon and drunk wine, and indeed raised and slaughtered pigs. Morisco resistance to pork, where it did exist, was probably much more a function of taste rather than religious or political issues. Individuals interrogated by the Inquisition made this point repeatedly. As one contemporary source put it, we have not eaten pork, quote, we have not eaten pork because we are not accustomed to it. We don't like it, basically. Moriscos in the small Castilian town of Damiel were reported not to eat pork because, quote, it did not agree with them. One Morisca woman from Granada explained to the Inquisition that, quote, Christians do not know how to cook a stew without using salt pork, but that in her land these same dishes were made with olive oil. And another Morisco in testimony before the Inquisition attributed his avoidance of wine and pork to his upbringing. He, quote, had never eaten bacon nor drunk wine because he was raised that way and not because he was practicing any ceremony or following any religious rule. Attempts to alter eating habits, in fact, flew in the face of the medical thinking of the day, which envisioned taste as a kind of a sympathy between a person's nature and a particular food. Food preference was mostly a consequence of one's humoral makeup and temperament. Thus, one's tastes could no more be changed than one's physical temperament and makeup. All this suggests, I think, the need to complicate our understanding of early modern foodways in Spain and in the Mediterranean. We began with Brillat-Savarin's famous quote, which has become an article of faith in food studies. Tell me what you eat and I will tell you what you are. As the example of the Moriscos illustrates, however, food certainly does function as a marker of identity and as a means to divide and distinguish, but it's important to distinguish who is doing the marking and who is doing the distinguishing. The example of the Moriscos suggests the need for caution in embracing too easily, or perhaps better, too exclusively, the ways in which food functioned as a boundary of identity. Caricature is a serious danger in the field of food history. What people eat is a potent ingredient of national and social stereotyping. And this can lead to distortions that mask much more complex realities in terms of both foodways and identity, which, once again, the Iberian example has shown us. This is evident in the Inquisition's emphasis on pork and wine, which I would argue was much less about identifying actual unique Morisco foodways and much more about disciplining and controlling what was a restive and potentially subversive community and trying to unify a new kingdom. We should not, in short, look too carefully to the Inquisition to provide an accurate culinary map of Spanish foodways in the early modern period. And finally, an exaggerated emphasis on the nexus of food and identity can obscure and oversimplify the rich and multivalent ways that foodways often transcend seemingly insuperable political and religious boundaries. This is apparent in early modern Spain, where overemphasis on rhetorical constructions of antagonism can obscure connections evidenced in the richly nuanced functioning of its culinary culture. And I believe that we can see the same in probably all parts of the Mediterranean if we look closely. Thank you very much for your time.